Hello, pastors and leaders. It is such a delight to be with you again for another episode of Spirit Anointed Leadership. Thanks so much for joining us. This podcast is specifically for you to help equip, empower, and encourage you to go after the mission that God has for us. You know, I am so excited about today's podcast and VCast because we're going to talk about a subject that I think so many of us want to talk about. We just don't know who to talk to about it. I think so many pastors go through their entire ministry run feeling embarrassed and, quite frankly, insecure about their financial situation, both personally and as a church. And so I knew that once I agreed to do Spirit Anointed Leadership Podcast and VCast, I knew that this was going to be one of the subjects that I really wanted to dive into. And I wanted people that are a lot smarter than I am, which isn't hard to find, but people that are a lot smarter than I am in the area of finances to join us. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Dave Lutz, who's a good friend and a certified financial planner. Is that right? And also Andy Miedema, who serves as the CFO here. Now, Dave, in your former life, in Dave Lutz 1.0, you worked for Herman Miller. You were a vice president for acquisitions.
Correct.
For Herman Miller, and then you retired from there. And you really thought about what does David Lutz 2.0 look like? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of when you changed careers and started helping people with their finances. But you've also served on first the West Michigan District Board and now the Great Lake Regions Board, our board, for many, many years now, maybe, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. And now you're serving as our treasurer, so we really have to keep our P's and Q's going well there. But you really have had a propensity towards finances from the time you were a really little kid. Would you, and I know that wasn't one of the questions I was going to ask, but hey, let's just have fun. Talk to me for a second about when did you first know that numbers and money was going to be something that you were going to be involved in?
You know, Chris, I'm not sure if I knew it at the time, but if you were to ask that question of my parents, they would tell you about an episode when I was probably in 3rd or 4th grade.
Okay.
And it was summertime. It was warm. I went to the store and I bought some popsicles.
Okay.
And I brought them to the neighbors to sell to the other kids. And there was one young man in particular who didn't have any money, but his dad worked in the automotive industry, and he had these model cars that they used to produce for advertising purposes. Okay. And so he traded me model cars for popsicle, and then I later sold the model cars for like a couple bucks a piece. And I think at the time my parents are going, okay, let's watch out for this guy.
That's awesome. Andy, same for you. How did you know that when did you first realize that you were going to be involved in the whole banking or numbers business?
Yeah, I really got involved when a friend of mine had gotten in the banking industry, and he offered me a job, and I got into banking and finance, and I just loved it right out of the gate. I just enjoyed the number side of it. I enjoyed the people side of it and putting the two together. So I've spent my entire career in the finance industry, and I love it. I love it living in here.
Awesome. Well, you know, one of the things, and I mentioned this in the intro today, that I think so often what happens is that people naturally look to a pastor as an authority figure, right? And so they go to him, or her, they go to her for like, not just spiritual wisdom and spiritual advice, but they go to her or to him for like, would you help me with my marriage? Would you help me with my parenting? Would you help me with that? And I think as a result of that, because pastors are asked for their opinion on so many different things, I think that often pastors feel this internal angst because they feel like I'm supposed to also know all about finances. And yet so many times pastors don't. I certainly didn't when I became a pastor. My parents were a financial wreck. Like, there was nothing wrong with the income side of the ledger. They just didn't have a clue how to control their spending or to be on a budget or anything. We'll talk eventually about that. And so I think so many pastors desire to have a conversation, but it's almost like pornography. It's just like they don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed about their own reality in it. So I'm so glad that the two of you have agreed to join with me today. And in our next podcast, we're going to actually record 2 podcasts because I think there's so much information we'll be able to fit it all in one, which I'm stoked about. But I want to go to the income side first. And Andy, I'm going to turn to you for that because one of the things that we as a region really want to help pastors with and churches with is the income side of the ledger for them personally. And I think good boards come together. And Dave, I've had this conversation with you as well, but boards that have good intentions come together and they really don't know how to think about their pastor's salary. As a matter of fact, I've made an observation, and maybe other people will debunk it, but my observation is if the pastor is making as much or more than people on that board and then the individual on that board member becomes really apprehensive about giving that pastor a raise. It used to be like sexy or whatever to that, godliness and poverty go together. You know what I mean? So we want our pastor to be poor because somehow that's more of a sanctification thing. But we in the GLR don't necessarily agree with that. And Andy, you've done and you do a great job of helping pastors think and churches think about how do we best compensate. And so let's talk for a minute about the fact that the discipline says, hey, every year, let's talk about, your pastor's salary and compensation. What are some of the areas that you think churches ought to be looking at when they do that review, which we hope that they'll do at least on an annual basis?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. This is an area we're really passionate about because we want to see two things. One is we want to see pastors be compensated as absolutely the best that they can. And we want to see that churches are paying their pastor within an appropriate context for their budget and the size of their church. And so we've developed some tools that we help churches evaluate what their situation is, what pastors are fairly paid, pastors in similar situations around the country are paid. And so we've developed some tools that we can help churches and boards and treasurers figure out what an appropriate compensation package looks like. When I've talked with boards, what I found out is that most boards just have no context whatsoever for determining their pastor's compensation other than what their pastor made the year before or what the last pastor made. Yeah. And as a result, most pastors are drastically underpaid. Yeah. So one thing I want to say is we've got a lot of resources that we can help churches figure out what an appropriate compensation package is. And then when you look at a compensation package, the three big things that people look at are, of course, the salary piece, the healthcare, the dental and vision and benefits, and then the retirement piece. But there's actually other components of compensation that we encourage churches to think about. One is a time off policy that it gives their pastor appropriate time away to recharge, especially time off on Sundays, coaching resources, an expense account that allows them to invest in training and leadership development, things like a sabbatical periodically to allow them to recharge. So those are a lot of the things that we encourage churches to consider when they're putting together a compensation package for their pastor.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things, Andy. First of all, the board members that I've known, just like you said, it's not that they don't want to do the right thing. Most of the time, I would say way north of 90% of the time, they want to do the right thing. The problem is they just don't know what the right thing is. They don't have the information that they need. And so what we're saying to them is, hey, the GLR would be delighted to come alongside of you. So what that means, or you help me know, what that means practically and pragmatically is that they can reach out to the GLR office, they can reach out to you, they can find you on our website, and they can say, hey, we're doing a pastoral review, salary review, and compensation review of our pastor. Can you help us with that? And you'd be delighted, I think, Andy, to walk them through that. Is that true?
Absolutely. I've done this with dozens of our churches, and I'd be happy to do it with more. So if you contact me, I will put together the analysis. I'll meet with your board. I'll meet with your treasurer. I'll talk them through and explain that so they can sit down with their pastor and make an intelligent decision that's affordable for the church and also appropriate for the pastor.
Yeah. So pastors, and leaders, I just want to encourage you, have your board watch the first 10 minutes of today's episode. I hope that we've encouraged you and encouraged them about what it looks like to actually serve the pastor well when it comes to compensation. And we get the fact that there are limits sometimes. Sometimes churches are just at a size and such that they can't do everything they'd like to do. We get that, but there are even conversations then that we can have with them about, well, then what does it look like for a fair vacation policy? Because if we're not being able to pay our pastor a lot, and they end up having to take a second job or something like that, then we want to make sure that we're fair to them. And I didn't even say along those lines that we want to help you find a person that can fill in for your pastor when they're gone. We've got a whole list of different pastors and leaders that will come in and preach for them so that your pastor can take a much needed, much deserved break. So that's that. And I want to say finally that we're going to come back around in our second episode and talk more about church finances. But let's move on now to to the idea of how can a pastor best be served when they think about their own finances. And I think, the first thing that comes to my mind is this 6-letter word that so many people hate as if it's a 4-letter word. And that's the word budget. So many people they think of budget and immediately they just start groaning. And it's like, no! Dave, help us here. How do we help people think differently about that word and about that concept?
Sure. Well, first thing is stop using the word. I intentionally talk to people about a spending plan because budget sounds restrictive. What can't I do? Whereas spending plan is how do I look intentionally about the funds that I have and plan to spend them in a way that meets my goals. And so I think thinking in terms of a spending plan rather than a budget, I think can help. The other thing that I always say is as you go along the journey, celebrate small wins. It takes a while to get your arms around what am I spending? What do I want to spend? Maybe even put that in the context of a financial plan and decide this is what it looks like. And it's not going to happen overnight. So celebrate some small wins and then hang out with people that are on the same journey and encourage each other.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point in that is that let's not do it alone. Let's make sure that we've got other people that understand this. If we're spending all of our time with people that are going out and spending a lot of money that they don't necessarily have, then that's probably not going to help our own contentment factor, right? That's not going to do it. And I think one of the things that's so fascinating to me, Dave, you and I have talked, and I'm not sharing anything that here is too personal, but back in the day, you actually set up, I think, if I remember, 8 or 9 or 10 different savings accounts for you that you just put money into. So this is my next car savings account, and this is my next whatever. So it's easy to see those things, and it's easy to put that money into that.
That's right.
Now, not all banks will let you set up 10 or 12 different savings accounts. What's fascinating to me is that, so my brother is a really bright guy. My brother, whose name happens to be David, works in missile defense, has for many, many years. He's a really bright guy. Do you know what he uses for his budget? Envelopes. He uses the Dave Ramsey envelope system, and he's got them hidden somewhere in his house. I don't want to know where. It's like top secret. He's got a top secret clearance. That's probably top secret. I don't want to. But what helps me to know is that I don't have near the brain capacity that he does, but he actually uses the envelope system, and that ends up, that's how he manages their finances and their spending plan, for lack of a better word. I think one of the keys in all this is to find someone that we can talk to and feel safe about. Andy, would you talk about that for just a second? Yeah, I just think we need an advocate. Does that make sense?
I totally agree. So it can be hard to try to figure this out yourself and figure out what to do and where you stand. It really is helpful if you can sit down with a trusted friend or somebody who's an expert in business or finance. Now, that can be hard to do if it's a member of your congregation. So you may have to go outside your church so you don't feel like you're undressing yourself in front of somebody who's at your church. Right. But find somebody, a business owner, somebody who's an accountant, somebody that you trust that can just help you get a handle on where you're at and kind of what your next important steps are and help you put together a spending plan or any other kind of plan you need to move forward. But really having somebody walk through with you like you would a counselor for anything else is really key to getting your hands around what's going on and figuring out a plan that'll work.
Yeah, that's so true. Dave, as you've watched people, what would you say are the top 5? Number doesn't matter, but what are some of the top financial mistakes that people make in their world? People who are not naturally wired like the two of you are. What are those mistakes that people tend to make?
Sure. Well, the first one goes back to what Andy just said, and I think of it, give yourself the gift of not having to know everything.
Wow.
I had an experience early in my career at Herman Miller where I had been doing acquisitions for maybe 5 years, and an outsider came in who had been doing it for a long time for a large public company, and I was kind of threatened by this guy. It's like, I need to know everything. By the time we got done working together, he had taught me that you don't have to know everything. You can't know everything. Your job is to go find someone who knows it that you're comfortable working with.
Wow.
And so I think one mistake we make is not giving ourselves permission to not know everything.
Wow.
It's like, let's get there.
That is so key. Just give yourself permission to say, no, I don't know this area of my life, or no, I'm not smart enough to think through this. Dave, I've come to you several times personally to say, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, to say, Dave, can you help me think through this? I remember a pivotal time, I don't know, several years ago now, when I just was so frustrated about stuff. I remember picking up the phone and calling my brother David. And one of the most loving things he did was he actually got in the car and he drove from Huntsville, Alabama, here to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I happen to live. And he spent about 24 hours with me just thinking through. But one of the most loving things he said to me at that point, and my finances weren't a wreck. I was just trying to think through what are the best next steps. But David said to me, Chris, I was in your exact situation a decade ago, where I just wanted to find a person of peace, a person of knowledge who could help me through. I think going back to what you said, and now what you just said, David, don't pretend that you know everything. Don't pretend that you have to know everything. Go find that person and allow them to help you take those steps. And I would say, like a Christian counselor, if the first person doesn't work out, that's okay. Then keep going until you find that right person.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, sorry. Second
Sure,
one.
sure.
I'll try not to interrupt you anymore.
No, it's fine. So then one of the mistakes that I see is failure to have a plan.
Okay.
I always tell people that to think about it this way. Where am I? Where do I want to be? And what's the journey look like to get there? And until you put that down, until you think through that, the chances of getting to Florida without a map and without GPS are pretty low.
That's so true. That's so true.
Yeah. I would tell you that one of the biggest ones that I think people miss is make time your friend, not your enemy. And in saying that, it's a way of saying start as soon as you can, start saving for the future. And it's interesting. I've done some examples that look at, in this case, what is $15 a month worth? Mm-hmm. And if you put away $15 a month and you get 8%, which that's probably close to average of what we get of stock market over a long period of time. Sure. If you save that for 10 years, that's not quite $3,000. If you save it for 20 years, is it double that? No, it's almost $9,000.
Wow.
And if you save it for 40 years, which is typical working lifespan for a lot of people, it's about $52,000. And by the time you get out to that 40 years, you've contributed about $7,000, and 45 is growth from time and the compounding of returns. Wow. So time can be your friend if you get started early, or it can be your enemy if you postpone. So make time your friend.
Okay. So start. Yeah, I remember. It's interesting. Like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I just for fun started putting $25 into a stupid little stash account. Now I do other things, but I wanted to prove that principle. I just wanted to prove out that principle. $25 a week, which almost anybody can do. And now my little account has got a little over $6,000 in it. And don't let Mary know this. I'm not, but I'm going to use that as part of a trip that I'll take Mary on. You know what I mean? But it's just $25 a month. or $25 a week. I hardly miss it. But it's real, and it compounds over time, as you just said. Andy, I think I want to end this particular episode by talking about the fact that I once heard a very influential pastor say, you know what, as pastors, we're just always going to have car loans. That's just the way it's going to be. Would you talk about that for a minute? Would you agree with that? Would you disagree with that? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I disagree with that, Chris. I mean, there's just no reason you have to have a car loan. That's a victim mentality of somebody who is just afraid and scared and doesn't understand that they can have control of their finances and have peace. So if you get a hold of your situation and make a spending plan, you absolutely do not have to make a car payment for your whole life. I know plenty of pastors who have been responsible with their money and they live without car payments. It's totally possible.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's just so easy, right, for us to go in and say, oh, my car's broken down and therefore, and now I've just committed myself to 4 or 5 years or longer, unfortunately, these days, of payments. And it's just, and I think, the Bible says godliness with contentment is great gain, right? I think, Mary and I, we drive a 12-year-old Honda Odyssey. That's, what we do. And there's not a bank within, a 10-mile radius that wouldn't love to give me a loan today on a brand new, $60,000 car or whatever, $40,000 or $30,000 or $20,000 car. But I think just learning to be content is a huge deal. I think one of the biggest differentiating factors between people like you and others is this whole idea of contentment. Would you mind, Dave, just how do you deal with discontent and content in your own spirit? That's not a question I plan to ask you, but how do you work that out in your own spirit?
Well, one of the responses I would give to you goes back to something you said earlier in this podcast, and that is paying attention to who I hang out with. I notice that if I hang out with people who, and I'll just say it this way, are overspenders,
sure,
are living perhaps above their means, it stirs a spirit of discontentment. All of a sudden, my car isn't quite good enough, or my house should look better, or wow, I don't have the latest. Whatever it is,
right.
As my wife would say, it gets my wanter going.
Okay.
And so you really pay attention to who's pouring into your life, who's setting examples for you, and I think that's a big portion of the battle.
Yeah, it sure is. Andy, would you add anything to that?
That's great advice. My wife and I have done that ourselves. We moved into a different area because we didn't want our kids to be growing up around, in an area where they felt like they had to compete and that other kids had more. We intentionally moved to an area where our kids would see other people who didn't have as much as they did. And so it just moved out of the neighborhood of keeping up with the Joneses and just spending our time with people where we could feel like we could recognize how blessed we really are.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Spirit Anointed Leadership. I'm so glad that you took your time. Here's what I hope. I hope that you'll make sure that you join us for the next episode, because we've got a lot more content to come, and I really think it's going to end up blessing you and helping you along your journey. So please join us for the next episode. And also do me a favor, would you make sure that you subscribe wherever you watch us or wherever you listen to us, and make sure that you share it with other people. And finally, would you send in to us comments or suggestions that you have about how we can serve you through Spirit Anointed Leadership Podcast. This whole podcast and VCast is for you. So let us know how we can do that. We'd be delighted to do that. Thanks so much and have a fantastic day.